All right, so we're back in chapter 2 of Daniel, which encompasses Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And if you remember from last week, we noted that verses 1 through 30 is all a narrative section of chapter 2. And we left off in verse 2, where Nebuchadnezzar basically called a cabinet meeting. And that brings us to verse 3. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. So that whole verse is an implication, and it implies that Nebuchadnezzar cannot remember his dream. He knows he had it. He might have had some flashes of understanding, but he really couldn't remember it. Now, what's interesting with this whole setup, there's actually people who try to do what they call dream recordings nowadays. Well, it was no different back then. The Chaldeans, or the smart or wise men of Babylon, had a dream reading system. What they did was people would tell them their dreams, they would record all their dreams, and then they would chart, after the person had a dream, the way their life went or the way it was supposed to go. They actually did that stuff. And they've uncovered a bunch of cuneiform tablets that are just recordings of dreams. It's really interesting. They would find similarities, and they said if you have a certain kind of dream, your life will go this way or it'll go that way. So it wasn't a lot unlike what happens in our legal profession today. They based the current interpretation of the law as it is interpreted from the past. So, that kind of reveals some of the, I guess you could say, even imperfections of our legal system. But, of course, it's all a bunch of basically hocus pocus because they really didn't know what was going on. They had tried in their human ingenuity to devise a clever system. They had a very systematical way of arranging these dreams, and they would reference them they had actually a dream manual. One cuneiform tablet was just a huge manual on what dreams mean. Too clever, basically, was their stuff. That the entirety of Babylon, they bought into it. Their whole society was wrapped up into it. Kind of like things that our society is wrapped up into nowadays. We get caught by cleverness. So their enemy was time. They can do pretty good with their stuff. They can pull out their bag of tricks and pull out their chicanery that they had in their manuals, and they got a dream to work on, but he had to tell them the dream. That was the kicker. I don't know what the dream is, basically is what Nebuchadnezzar told them. You tell me the dream, and then you can interpret it. So basically, that just shows us there's nothing new under the sun. There's all kinds of tricks and stuff going on in the background. It was going on in Babylon, and it goes on today. So verse 4, then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. So there they are. That's all they can do. And what's interesting here, it's the Chaldeans. They're like the top guys of the cabinet. They're the ones who do all the talking. So this is interesting. In this verse, the first few words were in Hebrew. And then it shifted to Aramaic. And that goes on all the way through chapter 7, verse 28. The whole section is in Aramaic. It was a common language at the time in the courts. And later it became the common language of this whole part of the Southwest Asia. It was the court language of Babylon, which involves all of it was recorded in Aramaic. Even the cuneiform tablets were in Aramaic. And it's actually a language that's very similar to Hebrew. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, because this section is a recording of Gentile history. So he goes from Hebrew to Aramaic, which was the common language of the Gentiles. So just to, they're asking the king, just tell us your dream and we'll tell you exactly what it means. We'll go back and we'll get out our manuals and all of our records and we'll find out what that dream means. And so all of that lets us know, all that archaeology that's been discovered is they were brokering for time. They needed time to do something. We'll show you the interpretation, they said, but we need you to tell us the dream. Well, verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. What a quick turn of events. And then verse 6, so here's Nebuchadnezzar's follow-up. If you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So he gives them two choices, basically. And they're probably rumbling amongst themselves, how are we going to do this? You cannot show me the dream or its interpretation, and I'll turn your houses into, and what the Aramaic word actually means is dunghills. And I've chopped you to pieces, and that's literally what it meant. They would chop them to pieces and scatter them all over the place. That basically was a denial of a proper burial. So on the other hand, just tell me the dream and what it means, and you will be top dogs in Babylon. So here, Nebuchadnezzar is kind of showing a very cynical side. He's putting them on the spot. And basically, Nebuchadnezzar was a cynic. This shows up all through the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar was too smart to buy into his own system here in Babylon. He must have thought the whole pile of them was a bunch of charlatans. It's like he didn't trust them from the get-go. It's almost like he's saying, if you're so smart, you've got all the supernatural information, you're always saying you speak to the gods, you know the destinies of men, so all right, tell me the dream and its interpretation. Let's see if you can pull it off. So it's really a challenge is what he's doing. So God is involved in this whole thing. That's something we have to remember. And God wanted him to forget the dream in order for, once and for all, to reveal the whole fakeness of the system of the world at that time. All the supposed wise men and their idols. It's devastating to Babylonian wisdom. Now, Leupold, in his exposition of Daniel, he said, we venture to say that if the Chaldeans have not made pretense of having access to the deepest and most completely hidden things, the king would never have made this unreasonable request of them. So they had basically propped themselves up as being the purveyors of wisdom and knowledge. It's almost like Nebuchadnezzar saying, okay, show me the money. Now this phrase, you shall be cut to pieces, it basically means I'll whack you into little pieces. And that's a devastating thing for a whole huge group of people. And this group of wise guys it was a big group. And then that term, I will, destroy your homes. I'll make your house a manure pile, is what it means. When somebody had dishonored themselves, or the king, or the Babylonian system, they were going to be defamed. And if someone wanted them to be defamed, they would kill the person. They would smash down the house, and they actually would build a public outhouse on the same piece of property. And again, in archaeology, they've uncovered these huge stone, kind of like outhouse seats. It's really interesting. As in 2 Kings, it says, they also broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and broke down the house of Baal and made it a latrine to this day. They actually did this in Jerusalem too. Josiah did it when he broke down the high places. He would make latrines over them. But on the other hand, if you do what I ask, I will give you great reward. So verse 7, they answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. So they really had no other option. Just give us the dream. Don't be unreasonable, king. So they faced an impossible dilemma. There was no way they were going to come up with the dream. Yeah, you couldn't win this competition if you were the only one in it. So as far as God was concerned, God let the king forget in order that God might show the stupidity of their whole phony system of religion. And that stuff goes on today. You often see that. They didn't have any corner on divine truth. They didn't descend into the supernatural world at all. They couldn't do a thing with all of their fakery and their trickery unless they knew the dream. So verse 8, the king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time. So there you have it. Because you see that the word from me is firm. He wasn't going to change his mind. He's basically saying, stop stalling. Start something. You're stalling, hoping that I'll forget what I said. That's basically what they're saying. It'll all blow over and it'll all cool off. You're just stalling. And then verse 9, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. So that verse right there shows the cynicism of Nebuchadnezzar. He's basically saying, I know you're all in cahoots against me. So he's basically saying, look, I'm going right back to verse 5. There's no alternative. There's only one decree for you. And if you don't tell me the dream, you know what'll happen. Cut into pieces. Homes will be made a manure pile. There's no other way. And he's basically saying, you lie. And that's why he wasn't convinced of his own system. He saw the phoniness of the whole thing. And we see that today in people who say they're atheists and stuff. But over time, they start to see, this whole thing there's problems with it. Same way with evolution. People who take it serious, they get to a point where they go, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. So I'm sure he knew the past stuff that they had told wasn't true at all. They had made such great predictions that never came to pass. He didn't believe the whole thing, and he was just cynical. Just like if global warming were true, we would be up to our armpits in water right now. We see this stuff today. So he wanted to show them up for the phonies that they were. Amazing that God uses the man against his own system. And that's one of the cool things of this. And that brings us to verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. So now we're getting somewhere. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. So they're admitting their deficiency. If you think there's anything in the horoscopes in the newspaper or on the computer other than demonic influence and mind control, you're wrong. There's no such thing as reading the future. The only place you're going to read the future is in the Bible. When God talks about it, and they were right, they were totally deficient. They couldn't do it. So what their experience, this is what their experience told them, that there was limits to what they could know. They could pull out their fakery and all their false system and read somebody's mind, but they themselves knew it was just a hoax. And it makes you wonder, can Satan read minds? That may well be an indication that Satan can't read our minds. Because if Satan could read our minds, then of course these guys would have been able to interpret the dreams and he could reiterate our thoughts. So we need to beware of Satan's agents, and that's what these Chaldeans were. They were Satan's agents, astrologers, mediums, spiritists, magicians, sorcerers, a whole pile of them. And they would have had experience in revealing dreams that were unspoken. They would have had experience in reading thoughts if Satan could read minds, but he cannot do that. 1 Kings 8:39. Then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive an act and render to each whose heart you know according to all his ways. For you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind. So that's telling us that God alone knows the human heart. There's no one else who has that ability. God knows what we will say before we even say it, while the thought is still forming in our minds. And that brings us to verse 11, and we'll stop right there and pick up with that next week.